Hi, welcome to Yale Daily News Multimedia and another segment of Everybody Has a Story, which is a weekly segment that we've started where we're interviewing interesting professors, staff, and students across Yale's community and bringing their stories to you. Today, we're here with Professor Beverly Gage, who is a professor of 20th century U.S. history and the author of the book The Day Wall Street Exploded, and her forthcoming book is about former and the first FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Cody.
So we're here today to talk about the inauguration, which happened this Monday of President Obama for his second term. And you were actually at the inauguration, and you saw it firsthand and gave some commentary about it. First question, just very broad. What were your impressions of the speech? There have been 16 second term inaugural speeches before this. How did this rank? Did the president accomplish what he needed to?
Well, technically I should say that I was sitting in a TV studio in Arlington, Virginia. I was doing a live inauguration special with the PBS NewsHour, and so technically I wasn't at the inauguration, though I hear that you were at the inauguration.
So you got the heater.
Huh?
You got the heater.
I got the heater, and I got the comfortable studios and the nice lighting. Exactly. And I would say overall that my impression of the speech was that it was really much more forthright than sometimes second inaugurals are, and that I really understood it as kind of an invitation from President Obama to the people that he sees as his coalition, as his constituency, to kind of come out and join him in pushing for the kinds of things that he laid out in the speech. And that's a little bit different from what we saw in his first inaugural, in the sense that that was really kind of a Washington speech, presenting to the country who he's going to be in Washington. And this seemed like a slightly more populist speech, actually, although, I think there are things that he included and things that he left out.
All that we the people stuff, it kept going. Is there, with inaugural speeches, especially second inaugural speeches, they're not as watched. I think it was 37 million watched his first one, and only about around 20 million watched this one. And they're not as exciting, though maybe Lincoln's second inaugural might be the best inaugural ever given. But is there something to be accomplished with a second inaugural address? Are there certain things that a president can do in that speech to set himself up for a successful second term?
Right, so all presidents have a kind of high bar for their second inaugural, which is, of course, that everybody already knows them. Many people have already formed their opinions about that particular president, and so it's quite different from a first inaugural in that sense. Barack Obama, I think, had one of the highest bars that any president has ever had, in the sense that his inaugural itself in 2009 was such a history-making event. My own son was in kindergarten at the time, and his school sat every kindergartner down to watch this historic moment, this inaugural address by the nation's first African-American president. So his bar was higher than most, so I think it's entirely predictable and understandable that the audience is somewhat smaller. I think what really happens in second inaugurals is A, that they fall flat, which is often the case, but B, that it's a moment to solidify more than it is a moment to introduce. And so for various presidents, they've sometimes been not the most spectacular speeches, but when they are good, they are really laying out not so much an agenda for policy, but an outlook on the world that they feel has been affirmed by their own reelection.
And, well, speaking of agenda, I mean, the president, in kind of a State of the Union-esque way, kind of laid out, his agenda for the second term, gay rights, climate change, gun control, immigration reform. What do you think the chances are that, he is going to be successful or going to get through significant legislation on any of these issues?
Well, I think to some degree, he was offering a few surprises, right? Particularly on climate change and on gay rights. These are issues that he's kind of danced around before. I mean, gun control was obvious, immigration was obvious. I think those two were actually a little bit less obvious. And so in that sense, it was kind of an important policy speech. The other thing that I think was interesting about this speech was that it seemed to signal a little bit of a shift from who he was in 2009, in the sense that then he had just run this mass popular campaign. He had done it so well. Barack Obama, the community organizer. But then he sort of retreated into a little bit of a Washington bubble, and he wasn't actually able to capitalize on a lot of that popular momentum and to call on people in an active way to continue to support him. And so I actually think that that's the most interesting thing. And the question then becomes, now that he's made this call, now that he's said, I'm going to be speaking more to public opinion, more to mass mobilization to put pressure on Congress, rather than trying to, kind of do deals behind the scenes, will that work? And I think that's really the essential question in whether or not any of these particular bills that he's laid out or policy agendas actually happen.
Well, it certainly sounded like a populist message, but one of the glaring omissions, I think, for a lot of people, or that a lot of people were talking about afterwards, was he really glazed over any foreign policy issues. He said a decade of war has ended. We're still fighting in Afghanistan. It's very real for the people over there. And he mentioned something about supporting democracy, but that was kind of it when it came to the foreign policy front. Was that striking to you as much as it was to a lot of people afterwards?
Well, I think that inaugural addresses in general, and then second inaugurals in particular, tend to either have a domestic or a foreign policy emphasis. So George Bush's second inaugural in 2005, it was all about foreign policy for obvious reasons, because he felt like that's where he had really made his mark at that point, and that's what he saw as the most pressing set of questions. So I don't think that it's particularly unusual in that sense for it to have one or the other emphasis. I mean, there was one other thing that was really quite striking to me that I felt like really wasn't in there as much as it might have been, which is that Obama, in his domestic sense, gave this big kind of social movement story that was about race and sexual identity and women's rights, and a kind of rights-based story of the American past. And he didn't talk very much, actually, in the end, about, say, the labor movement and the rights of labor, or really actually talk in a particularly significant way about the financial crisis, about Wall Street, about particular policies that he was seeking in that end, maybe because he feels like he's done what he wanted to there, maybe because he feels there's so much controversy around those kinds of policies. But his gestures there were very, very general and not particularly specific.
Now, one of his specific gestures, I know I was in the crowd when he said from Selma to Seneca Falls to Stonewall. Second, he said Stonewall. Everybody in the crowd went nuts, because it was, like you said, he's danced around the issue, and he was very clear on gay rights. Do you think that was directed at the Supreme Court? These justices sitting behind him who are going to decide on DOMA, on Proposition 8 in just a few short months. Was he trying to give them a message?
I think he was in part trying to give them a message. I think he's also trying to kind of build a new democratic coalition. And he's recognized, in fact, that gay rights and the kind of organized gay community is really going to be a very critical part of that, as the Latino community is going to be, right? I mean, if there are two constituencies that really have been natural democratic constituencies for a while, but who kind of got a bump up the ladder in significance at this inaugural, those were certainly the two groups. And I think it's interesting. I mean, one of the questions that historians always ask about presidents is, do they learn, right? Do they learn and do they change? This is the great story of Abraham Lincoln, who gave, the best second inaugural in American history as his story goes down. But, Lincoln, even on the question of slavery, right? I mean, he learned, he changed. He was a very different man on that question by 1864-65 than he was in 1861. And I actually do think that Barack Obama has evolved over the course of his presidency on the gay rights question, not only in terms of what he's willing to say in public, but really, how he thinks about that question in both moral and political terms.
Well, you bring up Lincoln, that's a nice segue into our final question, which is, obviously you saw the president look out onto the crowd, before he left and say, I'm never going to see this again. And, he had this great sense of pride, and you could see it. And all presidents seem to know, that posterity is going to have something to say about them. You're a 20th century U.S. historian, a presidential historian. What do you think in 50 years from now historians will say about Barack Obama? Will they view him in a favorable light?
Well, some of that depends on what happens over the next 4 years, and then some of it depends on what happens over the next 10 years or the next 20 years, and so it's hard to say. It is worth noting that second terms tend to be a little trickier and a little bit more difficult than first terms, and he's already had a fairly tricky and difficult...
Jefferson found that out the hard way.
Yes, exactly, and he's not the only one. George Bush found that out the hard way. So, I think there's some real challenges that lay ahead. I think he's been reaffirmed by the American public in this election, or at least by 51% of the American public. And in some sense, even just that fact has already sort of vaulted him up into the upper ranks of presidents. When historians spend their time ranking the presidents, right? It is very, very rare that a one-termer tends to make our ranks of great presidents, in part because of time, and in part because if you're not reelected, you're seen to have been unsuccessful or repudiated in some way. So I think that there are a lot of elements in place, from the historic nature of selection in the first place through to his reelection and his real legislative accomplishments at this point. But his historical legacy is certainly going to depend on what happens between now and 4 years from now.
Beverly Gage, thank you for joining us. And thank you for joining us. You've been watching YDN Multimedia, and this is the Everybody Has a Story segment. See you next time.